And on that basis, I will need to call for a nomination for a chairperson for the meeting, please. So can I have a nomination, please? From members of the board?
I would nominate myself, but I'm feeling a bit rubbish today. So I don't think I would do that role justice.
Okay. Thanks, Gemma. I hope you feel better. Are there any other nominations, please?
Michael?
Deathly silence.
If I can from the officer, would it be appropriate I could nominate Mr. Mark Mackenzie Charrington for chair?
I'm not sure that I like you that much, Matt. All right, you've got me.
John, Michael, everybody, Gemma, are you happy?
Yeah, happy with Mark to chair. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much. On that basis, Mark, over to you.
Right. Declarations of interest? None? Good.
No, good.
No additional. Thank you.
So we go to point 3, the minutes of the public meeting, dated 19th of October. Are people happy that they represent a true reflection of what was discussed and agreed?
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
Very good.
Noted, thank you.
Gonna tick these off. Point 4, the pension committee draft public meeting minutes from the 7th of December. Again, are members happy that that is a reasonable summary of what
I'm happy with that.
Thank you.
Well, actually, I should say, sorry, it's a case of have we noted it, because that is the pension committee, not our board.
Happy to note those.
Noted,
Right, item 5. A report titled Gloucestershire Pension Fund Update Part 1 Funding and Investment. And Matthew, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. And hopefully we will try and work it nice and simple for you today. Taking into the chair up on that side. So item 5, the quarterly updates. This is the standing item, which is the backward looking. It feels a little while ago now, looking back for the period ending 30th of September 2023. This is the information that also went through Pensions Committee. So obviously you can see their comments from the previous agenda item on those draft notes. Members will see that what we've actually done with this time is actually split this report into 2 areas. So if you remember, the last report you received actually covered funding, investments and governance, and is quite a weighty document and an agenda item to actually move through with a number of items. So what we've actually done is split it down into 2 separate reports, so we can focus more on some of that more activity that moves through. So the report in front of you, obviously, and the report and the agenda item covers from pages 11 to 19. The recommendation is on page 11, and that's really just to note the update in terms of the funding and performance of the fund to that period of 30th of September. So if we look at where we are in terms of that, so funding is on pages 12 to 13 of the report. The asset valuation of the fund still stands at over 3 billion. 3.115 million from billion from at the end of that quarter. It's a very slight movement from where it was in June. Very, very slight. When we talk about performance in a minute, you'll see how slight, because even though there's a slight asset movement, it actually translates to about a flat quarter of 0% increase during that particular quarter. As a funding level, though, the fund does remain in a very solid position at this point from a roll forward from the previous valuation. So the fund is now on its assets to liabilities ratio funded at about 154%, compared to where it was at 110% of the valuation. As we said with committee, we do note elements of caution with regard to this number at this moment in time, because that funding level percentage has not been driven by the change in the growth of assets during that period of time. So the physical amount of money that the fund holds has not materially changed during that period. What has changed is the assumptive basis on the liabilities. How much money do we need to hold today to enable us to pay out those pensions of the future? And where we have seen that the increase and the rapid increase in line with inflation, that has then driven increase in interest rates to actually then dampen that inflation, that maybe gives a bit of an artificial scenario of where we are in that longer term of where interest rates are likely to be in the longer term. So the actuary does always exude an element of caution when we look at those numbers. It's a good news story, obviously, from that perspective, but obviously it is one that we are cautious about because it more than likely is driven by kind of quite intricate fundamentals around that investment interest rates of where we sit at this moment in time. So as we said, in terms of investment performance over the quarter was flat at a 0% return during that period of quarter. It was behind the benchmark at 1.1%. We'll talk a little bit in the part 2 around the reasons and the rationale for that performance. And the majority of that is around our holdings around what we call the Magnificent Seven. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in that time. But on a 3-year basis, we're still annualized at 5.1, remembering that the actuary's requirement is 4.2 to where we need to be at this moment in time. So although it is strategically behind that benchmark, it is still actually, in excess of what the actuarial requirement is on that side. On page 14, we've still seen some movements in terms of our strategic asset allocation as a fund is predominantly now within its ranges within equities and fixed interests, as members will remember that has been slightly out of kilter for that period of time. So we're actually operating to our strategic asset allocation. And alternatives is the area where we're still seeing slightly underweight, but that's the commitment to monies in the private markets into infrastructure, private equity, private debt. That takes a while for that to be deployed across.
Yeah.
The one areas to note, the Schroders Greencoat, that you may recall that was an investment and a partnership that had been created by the fund. We're really pleased that now has actually been completed, and with a total commitment of that creation of that Wessex Garden Fund, with a total commitment of 330 million for 6 funds within the Brunel Pension Partnership, of which we're one of them. And that is now targeting investments into a wide range of solar PV. We're hoping within the next week or so that there will be an announcement over the first deal that Wessex Gardens has actually transacted on, and it will be quite a major deal, and we'll actually see a large deployment of our commitment already into that particular area. So I will circulate that press release around once that actually comes in. It's still sitting in my inbox in draft, waiting for the nod from Schroders to allow that to actually go through. And then finally, on the responsible investment update, there's some more information there around that, some clarity on our fund equity holdings. I won't talk too much on that because obviously the responsible investment policy is another major agenda item for us later on that side. So at that point, Chair, I will stop there and take any questions that members may have with regard to that report.
Thank you. Anybody got any questions for that? Or for Matt?
No, nothing for me. I think that's really clear.
I think the one question I've got, which may not be entirely relevant, but are we able at this stage to tell how we've compared with our fund to some of our near neighbours, part of the sort of group which are under Brunel, and also how does the position that we find ourselves in compare with the general investment market, whether it be stock exchange or whatever?
Thank you very much. So we do undertake benchmarking each year. That report is likely to be available for the June or July board meeting. So it does the 12-month performance every year to the 31st of March. So we will get an indication of where we sit in relation to into our peer group. I suppose my high level comment is against how have we done against the stock market and other areas. I think that can be actually taken into account when we look at the benchmark, because the majority the benchmark of the composite benchmark of the fund is a constituent parts of all of the underlying portfolios and their benchmarks, which are in certain cases the FTSE 100 or the MSCI or World, and it then depends upon the level of the exposure to those particular component parts. We look at our performance, that we are behind the benchmark on the quarter by 1.1%. So actually, you've more than likely seen us underperforming in those major areas, and we'll talk about that a little bit deeper in part two. There is a story and a rationale behind it, and a lot of it relates to what we call the Magnificent Seven, or 7 stocks which have predominantly driven a large proportion of the investment market. Your Amazons and your big tech organizations which are in there. And because of the workings of the responsible investment ethos and the responsible investment policies that we have in place, we are materially on some of our portfolios, like the sustainable, underweight in those particular stocks. So that actually equates for some of that performance. But Joe, we will dive a little bit deeper into that in the second part of this report in the exempt session, where we talk a little bit deeper about that and some analysis about the portfolios we're invested in versus their peer group analysis of that particular portfolio. In terms of where I'd say, where do we sit with our counterparts within Brunel? Ultimately, we're all invested through the same portfolio, so we're actually receiving a similar performance from those portfolios. What will be the determining factor will be the strategic asset allocation of each particular fund. So it will determine which of those suite of portfolios that Brunel offer and to what levels are being actually taken up by particular funds, which ultimately will drive the performance difference between us and our counterparts within Brunel moving forward. Hopefully that does help, and I'll answer the question.
Thank you, Matt. Unless anybody's got further questions, we can move on to item number 6, the fund update, part 1, governance and operations.
Yeah, happy to move on.
Hey, thank you.
Over to you, Matt.
Back to me, and I might bring Andy Cunningham in at certain points during this discussion, or I'm certainly maybe some questions come through up on this side. So, as I said, what we've done with agenda item 6 is actually split the report from funding and investments into one report, and then governance and operations in another, just to focus on those 2 particular areas. The report covers from page 21 to 42 in your packs. The recommendation is on page 21. The board notes the update provided and the governance undertaken, and any subsequent recommendations agreed by the committee at their meeting in December. The report covers a number of areas in terms of the employer activity, which seems always incessant, that we're having employer activity moving through, whether that's new academies putting out contracts, or academies moving multi-academy trusts, or generally just employers at this opportunity looking at their funding levels and moving forward. So we do see a lot of employer activity on an ongoing basis as a fund, in respect of new MiTID bodies coming in, and obviously ceasing bodies moving forward and moving through. One of the major areas that we have seen, and on page 23 of your reports, are a number of consultations which have been launched, and I'm sure colleagues that were up at the LGC conference in York more than likely had a number of agenda items on consultations that are going on at this moment in time, and subsequent to that, other things that have actually just recently been launched through government, which we will talk about. We can verbally bring those things in. So looking at page 23 of your packs in terms of the consultation update, the next steps on investments was included within the autumn statement within that side. So there are potentially three things and three key points that need to be considered with regard to that autumn statement. The first one is obviously the confirmed deadline or the accelerated deadline of March 2025 to ensure that all assets are actually operating within the pool. From our perspective, we have already complied with that requirement. The Gloucestershire Pension Fund at the moment is somewhere between 97 or 98% invested via Brunel, via the pool. I think that is maybe more targeted to other pools and maybe some other funds that are maybe potentially lagging. But all of our equity, our fixed income, and to a degree, all of our new commitments to private markets and alternatives have been made through Brunel at this juncture. The only thing that we have outside is the allocation to some existing private debt funds. One of the ones, obviously, that needs to be consideration as an impact is the setting of a direction of fewer pools exceeding the 50 billion. Obviously, Brunel at this point in time is subscale of that 50 billion as a collective of 10. I think we're somewhere between 38 to 40 billion pounds at this time. So that is something that we would need to be that is under consideration, would need to be under consideration with regard to the size and the scale. I think my response to that would be is that there would need to be a demonstration of a business case of the value that moving above that 50 billion would actually bring to the partnership. And I do know that there is some work that is being undertaken by the shareholders, which are the 10 funds, and the oversight board representatives are working with PwC at this moment in time to actually bottom out what that universe might look like and what certainly some of the gains would be up in that area. And the third one is the government's desire of an implementation of a 10% allocation ambition for investments in private equity. We currently have a 3% allocation to private equity. I believe that would be more of a comply or an explain position rather than being a forced position to move into private equity and to venture capital. But what I would say, this was on top of the 5% to infrastructure, the 5% to levelling up, and now a 10% towards private equity. So there is a push to affect around 20% of the investment portfolio into different areas. And as long as the investment rationale stacks up, I don't see there's a reason why we wouldn't invest into those particular areas, but it has to meet those obligations and the fiduciary duty of the fund in that particular side. But we do await more guidance with regard to that, and I'm sure certain colleagues will have some comments to make from the recent conference on those particular areas. One bill to note, which is moving through Parliament at the moment, which is one that also may be brought through, is about the boycotts, divestments and sanctions bill. The only main issue is that investment could be affected by formal government sanctions, embargoes and restrictions moving forward via that bill. We've not really seen this as an issue for LGPS at this particular time. And the potential will be that it would be overseen by the TPR for us if this comes through. It is going through its readings within the House at this time, and we're just awaiting the outcomes with regard to that. We don't really foresee it too much as an issue realistically for the LGPS, but it is just certainly something to be aware of. And I think the final one to actually note, which we will come on to in a moment within the governance review, which was the what we call the single code of practice. We've been promised this for a long period of time, for the codes of the 14 codes of practices that are out there at this moment in time, being consolidated into a single code for the LGPS and the pensions regulator to operate to. And very early in the new year, quite by surprise, all of a sudden, we actually had the single code of practice go through its legislative route, and it is looking at becoming enforced from March of this year. So we will be doing some work to effectively test where we sit with regard to that single code and whether or not there are any enhancements that the fund will need to make during that period of time on that side. I think I'll move on to onto the operations side. Or actually, what I might do, Chair, before I move on to the operations side, is I'll just stop there actually and see if there's any specific comments or questions with regard to the consultations, because I think there are two distinct things, if that's okay with yourself, and then obviously come back to me for the next part of the report, if that's okay.
Yep, that's absolutely fine. Anybody got some observations, questions?
I was going to ask a question about the single code of practice, but Matthew's answered that anyway. Because that was certainly picked up at the conference in York. It was very much felt at a conference in York that the 10% private equity was an aspiration and maybe something that funds wouldn't necessarily adopt, because it might be that there wasn't the return there. But also there were questions about whether it should be private equity based in the UK or anywhere in the world, and it was kind of said, well, it's an aspiration, we'd like you to, but it's not. That's not an area where we'd be looking to sort of insist you comply with it. The pooling area was one that it's basically saying that that was one you'd have to comply or explain why you're not. But as we comply anyway, that's not anything we've got an issue with.
That's an interesting point to make, Michael, because my sort of lean on that is that private equity, as interesting as it may be, is often very difficult to get out of, and 10% struck me as quite a high proportion of the fund to be striving for. But it's I'm not the expert on this, but that was my sort of layman's observation on that. There was something else in the back of my mind which I now completely lost, so I'll have to come back to it.
I'll just respond and give you some time, Chair, to kind of think of that one. So yeah, from my understanding and what we've seen, you are correct. I think it's well documented that the government, the LGPS is not a sovereign wealth fund, so it can't direct the investment per se on this. What we are expecting is comply and explain to be incorporated into the investment strategy statement of each particular fund. So each fund will have to determine, its aspiration, as you are rightly to say, in that particular area, and why it may or may not comply with that aspiration. I think some of what the ask from government is around actually what I would consider the venture capital end of private equity. I think the private equity in itself is maybe a more higher risk area of investment. Venture capital is certainly a very high risk, and it's the risk versus return aspect that is actually the key that will be the key differentiating factor on that. And I think the risk appetite will be the one where the venture capital, there is a desire obviously from government to kickstart the British economy and actually invest into kind of the green technology and and that green transition of aspirations of venture capital and startup organizations in that particular area, and trying to unlock funding for those organizations, and the LGPS party being part of that. But it will ultimately be built in with the ultimate strategic asset allocation. But it might just be that the fund then also needs to then comply or explain the rationale of why it may or may not be investing in that particular area. But certainly it's something that we're expecting will be a requirement to comply and explain via the investment strategy statement of the fund moving forward.
I've now remembered what I was, the other thing. I sat in yesterday on a 45-minute webinar about the new code of practice replacement of, 14, and it's pretty dry stuff, but I can understand that it does require, if we're into code 14 at the moment, it is a good thing that they've decided to have a complete fresh look at the whole thing, and everybody can be operating on an even keel.
Yeah, thank you. I think, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the code is about 170 pages long, so we are working our way through it slowly. in terms of that. And what we will be doing is actually reviewing our position versus that particular code. And there will be we will bring reports back to both committee and the board with regard to the position of the fund, with regard to where it sits with that single code. As we move forward, that will be the aspiration, that we'll be bringing that back to the next, I would hope, to the next board meeting. And then ultimately that might potentially then drive any work plan that is required if there's any areas that we do need to concentrate on to ensure our compliance. So it is something that myself and Andy will be working on closely to ensure, and actually we will bring that back to the board and committee, obviously, as we understand our position with regard to that code. But one thing that we are hopeful of is obviously the work that's been undertaken around the review that we did with Aon on governance, and utilising the good governance framework will hopefully put us in a reasonable position when it comes to actually understanding that code as well around the governance side of it.
Excellent. Right.
Okay.
Matt, why don't you carry on with the sort of second half of this?
Yeah, thank you. So we'll move on to on the operational side, onto to page 25 of your report, which is focusing on the KPIs, the business plan, and the governance review. So looking at the KPIs, and if we go to page 27, you can see the charts moving towards where we are sat with the KPIs at this particular point. They are consistent with the previous quarter, but case volumes remain high, across that. If we look at page 29, you can see that there's still increasing amounts of case volume that is actually being undertaken and produced by the team on an ongoing basis. So where we were sat at around 2,000 cases back in April 2021, on average we're at about 2,500 over that rolling 12-month period. So we see ever increasing caseloads, but that also is consistent with our ever increasing membership as we actually go through up on that side. Looking at page 27, obviously the KPIs that we have, obviously we're pleased that the transfer outs are meeting their targets. And obviously where we're sat with the estimates and the retirement grants, we're moving back up towards that 90% target over time. Obviously we do have holiday period during this quarter, which normally reduces the amount of resources that we do have. We are still progressing with recruitment, but then we have a large number of new members of the team in place now. Ultimately, the challenge we have now is upskilling them in a way that brings them into being effective. Ultimately, that does impact on our experienced practitioners, because they are the ones that are imparting the knowledge to the new members of the team actually as we move forward. So we are, myself and Andy are pleased that the progress that we are making progress towards it. We do envisage over the next few quarters that we should be moving towards a consistent base around the 90% over time, but it will just take us that period of time to actually achieve that moving forward, as we actually get there and we embed those resources in moving forward. Looking at the business plan, the business plan ultimately has been tracking to target. If I focus on the core projects, on pages 33 and 34 especially, the responsible investment policy is a separate agenda item which we'll follow through shortly. So we've seen a lot of progress and a lot of work undertaken with regard to that. It's a moot point whether or not you could actually call that initial project complete versus to where we are now in terms of the consultation of that moving forward. The second core project was around the administration system contract. And since writing this report, that project has now been completed to the extent that the procurement exercise has been undertaken. It is now on public record that contract has been awarded to the incumbent provider, Haywards, for a 10-year period. We are just in the throes of now agreeing the terms and conditions from that framework and the legals and act to actually complete the sign up of that. that procurement exercise was a very vast undertaking, from strategic procurement support that we received, but also a lot of resource time from the team, and it was admirably led by Andy on that side of things. That also, procurement also procured new parts of the technology that was approved as well. So the connectivity around member self-service, and also the ability for employers to be uploading their data on a more regular basis, on a monthly basis. So an employer portal to actually communicate that data through to us. And that product's known as iConnect moving forward. So a way that we will interact with our employers and capture data will be much more on a real terms basis. And then ultimately what we will be looking at is obviously then member self-service in there as well. So that project itself does the procurement exercise has been completed. I'm pleased to say that also came in under the forecast budget that we actually had for that process and procurement, and that is now on public record as well in terms of that. Ultimately, those next two stages themselves, the rolling out of iConnect to the 200 employers, and the work that will be required, and obviously the member self-service to our actives and deferred members, will now obviously form a number of projects that we will need to be undertaking over the short to medium term. And I'm sure you'll see those through into the next business plan that will come through at the next meeting with regard to those. And then finally, obviously, the governance review as well. We are coming towards the end parts of that governance review. That the areas that really remained was around the cyber strategy and the continuity plans. A lot of that was interlinked then with who was going to be our IT supplier moving forward. Now we have clarity on that. We should be able to finish off those elements of the governance plan and the single code of practice, which we've been sat there as Amber awaiting that code. Now we have that, we should be able to finish that part of it off, which ultimately then really just leaves us with the communications policy and the fund identity, i.e. the branding of the fund, as the two areas of the governance review that are actually left to enact, to enable us to actually come through on there. So at that point, Chet, I'll stop there and take any questions, and I'm sure Andy might have some be able to answer any questions on the KPIs and other aspects as well. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Matt. Any questions from anybody? If not, I will throw in one vague question. Matt, can you explain in simple terms what is the difference in the role that Hayward's will now be taking on over what they have been providing up to date? And presumably, you are confident that the fact that you've appointed them, that they're able to do it. But I'm assuming that roles have changed significantly enough that you had to go out for full consultation on the reappointment.
Yeah, we'd the previous contract didn't have any extension clauses in it. We did actually take a 12-month extension to allow us the time to actually undertake the full procurement exercise that was required under under public procurement regulations with regard to the contract. So it was something that we had to do. Obviously, it is a limited field. We have confidence that Hayward, obviously via appointing and moving through, that was one of the major issues. Can they actually supply? In terms of what they currently do for us, in terms of providing the basic administration system, a calculation package, a workflow, and also hosting our environment for us. So in other words, they provide all of the servers and the data rooms and maintain that, which was that is similar to what they were doing before. There is no changes to that. The changes and the new parts of the system that we've procured is around the member self-service functionality and also the employer portal iConnect. And those are new modules which we will now be focusing on working with Hayward to actually project manage then the rolling out of and the implementation of those two modules moving forward. on that side. So it's actually building on the architecture that we've already have in place with them. Obviously, what it means with working with the incumbent, because we don't have a transition now of the administration platform or the hosting environment, it should mean that we can move faster into the member self-service and the employer portal, because the bedrock of the calculation system is already up and running and in place. So there's no material change to that moving forward on that side. We are also hoping that we should see some improvements within our reporting, and then also the driving of through the workflow, and then our KPIs in the future. We'll be looking at reviewing those as we embed that more into the new system moving forward as well. I see Gemma's put a...
Thanks very much. Yes, it strikes me that the flow of information, and because of the increasing numbers of members and so on, that with the employer input and so on, that you can get hold of information much more readily, and that obviously is the benefit of everybody involved. So well done. It sounds an excellent appointment. Right.
I think Gemma's got her hand raised, I believe.
Oh yes. Sorry.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Matt.
Your picture frame.
So just I guess leading on from that, because at the conference last week, there was a very, very clear message on the pensions dashboard. And forgive me if I'm jumping a little bit ahead in the papers, but that this deadline of October 26, there's been sufficient notice. I mean, what's it been? It'll be about 10 years, right, since it's been initially announced. So with this new system, does that then mean there will be a more detailed plan now as to what needs to happen and when, to get to a point where we can comply with the requirements for the dashboards?
Okay. I think ultimately with pension dashboard, the pensions dashboard, but this architecture that we're putting in now will put us in a much better position to comply with the requirements of pensions dashboard, but also more so that the output, when people, if people then find their information via the dashboard, when they reach out to us, they will actually have a much better experience when they actually do that, because we should be able to give them immediate connectivity into their pension record. If you think of what pensions dashboard is just a centralized area where there's some information to connect people with their pensions. So obviously, if a member already has member self-service and they need the view of pensions dashboard, won't actually really impact on them completely. The issue is obviously, if with pensions dashboard, when we connect to that architecture, which which our current provider has solutions for as an IP, I can't remember if it's called an IP provider. That they provide services for in it 60 or 70 LGPS funds out of the 80 odd that exist. So we're all in that boat, operating together in terms of the architecture and that connectivity. For us, it's more about when a member, if they then find their data through, I was a member of the Gloucestershire Pension Fund, and then they click through on the dashboard, we will then be able to then give them access via their member self-service record to their data, and it should be more real time. Whereas at the moment, we would just say you need to contact or email into this team, and then it would then become a very much more a burden on the team in terms of somebody then asking questions and then having to respond to it, rather than giving them access to their data in a real time. So the movements and the adoption of the modules that we're bringing on will allow that when dashboard actually happens to connect people to their pensions, means that they should get a much better experience when they're then looking at the Gloucestershire Pension Fund information than they would do at this moment in time, if that makes sense. And we'll see if dashboard actually we will be given a lot of notice by government as well of when that connectivity date is. I think, just from a perspective, there's also I think there's a view that it will be interesting to see how successful Dashboard actually is, bearing in mind the way that people actually access information nowadays. And searching on a government website is maybe not the way that a lot of people will do things when you're talking about mobile connectivity and apps and other things. So I think there's a lot of chatter around whether or not Dashboard is already being created on old technology as we see it, even before it's actually been rolled out. So the effectiveness and how that connectivity happens will be an interesting one moving forward. But yeah, certainly Dashboard is something that is on our radar, and a lot of what we're doing now with our IT systems will put us in a much better position to be able to conform and comply and give our members a better experience when they go via the Dashboard into us in the future. That's part and parcel of what we're doing and why we're doing this.
Okay. Excellent, thank you, Matt. Yeah. So if everybody's happy on that item 6, we move on to the risk register.
Okay, thank you. I think this again, hopefully